Hello, and welcome to the lecture on effective peer review. In this lecture, I'm going to be talking about why we do peer review on essays in this class, and the difference between revising and editing, as well as giving some tips for effective peer review. You may want to return to this lecture throughout the course of the semester just for a refresher on how we conduct peer review. I'll always also post instructions on the discussion board so that you can have details about the type of review we're doing and what the expectations are for the specific review. I want to start by answering the question, why peer review? Now, the main reason that we're going to be doing review is because we're viewing writing this semester as a process. It's not something that is just product-oriented, meaning that I give an assignment and you produce a product, but instead we're going through a process of thinking through, composing, rethinking, revisioning, and then submitting the product at the end. So the process is as important a part as the actual product. And your best writing will happen in the context of real readers responding to your drafts. So rather than just me being the only audience for your product, what we're thinking here as writing as a process is that part of the process will be testing your writing with an audience of real people, and that will be your peers. So you're not composing in isolation, and that's true for any kind of composition that you do out in the real world. Much of what you write or images that you compose is read and is commented on by your social network already. You already have a built-in audience that happens with the types of composing that you do in your daily life. And getting feedback from peers, especially those working on the same assignment, can help you to re-see your own work. So when I talk about revision, I'm talking about the process of re-seeing or revisioning your work. So helping you to re-see it is part of the process of writing, and doing that with peers is how that happens. So peer review leads to revision, and that's a key step in the process, and that's why we'll be doing that this semester. Practice of peer review means that you're going to be giving feedback on an essay. Or if we compose projects, you would be giving feedback on the projects. Now, the temptation, of course, is to just give feedback that says, oh, I really like this. Or to be on the other extreme and be so critical that you're saying everything you did is wrong. We want to avoid those two extremes, and the way that we can do that is to think through the composition pyramid, which appears in your textbook. The pyramid shows the levels of importance in peer review and in revision and can help us visualize the different types of feedback that you want to give. The most important type of feedback is to make sure that the draft matches the assignment and that it has a clear thesis. So rather than saying, good job on this essay, you might point out that the situation that's described in the essay does or doesn't match the assignment very well. You can also focus in on the issues that are being discussed, on the thesis itself, which I'll give some examples of how to respond to a thesis later, and to the audience, making sure that an audience is broad enough or narrow enough depending on the scope of the argument. That level of feedback and those focusing on those particular topics will be more helpful than the lower levels on the composition pyramid. The second most important is to make sure that the draft uses good organization and enough developed examples. So organization would be just making sure things logically flow, and then the effective use of sources or examples to support the thesis. What you're going to do there is just make sure that the examples actually make sense and that logically correlate to what the thesis says. The least important level of feedback is fixing issues of style and grammar. This is probably the easiest thing to point out for those of us that are looking for quick feedback to give, but it actually is the least helpful because you could have an essay that's technically grammatically perfect, but actually doesn't meet the terms of the assignment, isn't well organized, and really doesn't have a clear thesis. In that case, pointing out grammar errors isn't going to help that peer and isn't going to be the kind of feedback they need. So as we do our peer review process, I'm going to ask you to focus more on the top level concerns and kind of try to avoid fixing people's grammar unless that draft is just absolutely perfect in every other way. So keep this situation in mind in terms of how the levels of feedback work, and I'll be using that as a guide as I give more instructions. I want to talk now about the differences between revising versus editing because they're really not the same thing. So on the left-hand side of the slide here, I've described what revising is. In this case, it would be comparing the product to the original assignment. So taking the final essay and looking back against the original assignment sheet and seeing what still needs to be done, what could be missing, what could be expanded, and then putting those things in, or perhaps deleting things that are not relevant and taking those out. Number two, explaining when you didn't understand an example and suggesting a new example is a great way to help people with the revising process. So if you're reading an essay and you see that there's an example in there that doesn't quite make sense, you can point that out, and that helps lead the writer to the process of revision as they have to rethink that example in light of an audience. You can also, as a reader, compare the thesis sentence to the examples. If they don't logically follow each other, then you want to suggest changes. Helping the writer have perspective on their tone or how the organization does or does not persuade also is a good way to help guide towards revision. So most of our suggestions during peer review should help the writer re-see the essay in this way. Giving the writer an outside perspective on what works and what doesn't work is more helpful than just pointing out editing changes. So editing then, on the right-hand side of the slide, is spelling changes, word choices, correcting citations, adding or deleting commas, or making other minor changes, perhaps with transitional words or reordering paragraphs. During peer review, you should only do minimal editing of your peer's essay. If you see major grammar issues, you want to simply write a sentence to indicate that. You don't want to correct all of their errors. Mainly, you want to point out, hey, I think you might have some grammar problems here. Go ahead and take a look at this. Rather than spending all of your peer editing time on correcting, you want to do more peer revision time, pointing them towards larger areas that could be useful in terms of re-seeing their essay. On the next couple of slides, I want to talk about tips for effective peer review. How do you actually do the process of review when you're a reader and then as you're a writer? So the first advice that I'm going to give is to read the essay through, then to read it again, and then to respond based on notes that you've been compiling. So I suggest taking out a sheet of paper or opening up a digital document where you can compose notes as you're reading. That way it will help you to remember the things that you're responding to as you read. So in the first reading, I find that it's very helpful to read the essay out loud to yourself. And I mean actually reading it out loud with your voice, so that way you can hear the way that it sounds, and sometimes when you hear things, it will help you catch strange transitions, grammar errors, or things that you may not catch if you're scanning it over. I also recommend doing that as a writer. When it's time to turn in the final draft, read your own essay out loud to yourself and see if everything is flowing really well. Number two, you should also be making notes while you're reading, especially about places where you feel confused or not persuaded. So in that digital document or on that sheet of paper, if you get to a paragraph and it doesn't make sense, make a little note in your document that says paragraph 3, I wasn't sure about X, whatever it is. You can also make notes that are positive. Paragraph 5, I thought this was a great transition. So doing those notes will actually help give you some context for creating better feedback than just I liked it or I didn't like it. You also want to think through on the first reading what the essay's thesis is. If you can't find the thesis immediately, you should make a guess and write down something on your sheet that says, I think the thesis is this. Most of the time, I'm going to ask you as part of the peer review process to specifically spell that thesis out for the reader, so go ahead on the first reading and see if you can identify it and write it down. After you've gone through the first time, you can do a second reading. Silently would be fine for the second reading, and you want to look back and see if each example that the writer uses connects back to the thesis. So if you think through, the first reading is more first impressions, the second reading is going to go a little bit deeper in terms of feedback. Looking specifically for how examples are developed, deciding what examples are most and least effective and making a note about that, and then thinking through if this was your essay, what would you want to fix first? And then what do you think the best part of the essay is? So always looking for positives as well as what can be revised. After you've compiled a set of notes based on 2 readings, you're also going to look at the peer review questions and instructions that I've given for each particular assignment. They'll have some questions that I'm asking you to answer related to the readings that I've just asked you to do. So a lot of times the advice I gave you on the previous slide will be echoed in the peer review instructions, and you'll just want to transfer over your notes into a format that will let the reader be able to digest them a little more easily. And you'll see that on the discussion board in the instructions on how to do that. So what I'm asking you to do then as you compose that feedback is to think through how you would like to be addressed as well. Remember that the essay that you're reading could be someone's best work. Even if it feels a little messy to you, that might be that person's best work at that time. So do be kind and consider your tone when giving criticism. And I found that asking questions instead of making proclamations is actually a more effective way to help people re-see their own work. So you could phrase things as, have you thought about giving a different example for logos? Rather than saying, you should really give another example, this one is terrible. Obviously, we can hear the difference in how it would be more effective to help someone by using a kinder tone and an open questioning tone rather than just telling them what they've done wrong. You also don't want to overwhelm your writer with feedback. That's why I've designed assignment sheets that are going to help you make your feedback a little more compact. I'm asking you to pick out a maximum of 3 things that they can work on, and you'll see that on the assignment sheets as well. If you find more than 3, rank those in the top order of what you think is most important and give them only those 3. So it may be that you think there's a lot more that that person can do, but it's really not going to be helpful for them to have every sentence parsed. Instead, they really need to know, what can I just focus on to get me to the next level of revision? And please remember that grammar is the least important and should not be a top 3 unless the essay is nearly perfect. I also encourage you to invite the conversation with the writer, offering to give them follow-up feedback if they revise based on your suggestions. So if you say, I think you need to rephrase your thesis sentence, you can also say, why don't you send it to me later and I'll see what I think. Obviously, not everyone is going to have time for every essay to create that kind of conversation, but I think partnering up and inviting that conversation will be a helpful process for you as you continue to revise before the final due date. And then as a writer, when you get that feedback sheet back and you're looking at how to rethink through your essay, remember that you don't have to use every piece of feedback that you get. It might be that your vision for the essay is different than what the writer responded to. Keep in mind, hey, this is what was most important to them as a reader, so maybe I need to rethink the way that I'm approaching my essay, but I don't have to change everything just because they suggested it. You don't have to immediately dismiss their feedback because probably if they're not getting what you're saying, you need to do some revising, but it might not be the actual revisions that they suggested. You might need to revise for clarity rather than examples if you feel like they didn't understand your examples. So keep that in mind as well, and be open to conversation about your work. Whether you're a strong writer or just beginning, everyone benefits from hearing how another person views our work. And just as a personal testimony, I continue to write in the academic field. That's just part of the practice. You always get feedback from people because what you think in your mind and what you're writing down on the paper may not be communicating effectively to an audience. So being open to that and receiving criticism and receiving support as well is a very helpful part of that process that I've been talking about. So be open to that and make sure that you're trying to incorporate at least one suggestion that was said by your reader. So it might be grammar if that's the least important thing, and it will probably not have the most effect on your reviewing process. But if you get some feedback that's really out of left field, you're not really sure what to do with it, you can contact me and then we can focus on one particular thing that you might say or you might change in your draft. You can also visit the Writing Center and ask them for additional feedback and a second revision. So there's lots of different ways that you can incorporate some of the feedback that you could get out of the peer review, but you do want to try to do at least one thing and think about how that one thing could help improve your essay. So these are just some tips to get us started with effective peer review, and we'll be learning how to do that better and better throughout the course of the semester. For this week, you need to see the discussion board for details on how to format your peer review and how to participate in the review by submitting your draft. A complete draft, including your image for your ad analysis, is due by Saturday at 11:59 p.m. And then you will see the sheet that I've asked you to download and use in terms of creating some feedback for your writer. Look for my thread on how to format that feedback, and that feedback itself is due by Monday at 11:59 p.m. So be sure that you're posting your draft on time so that you can find a partner, and then making sure you have that feedback back by Monday so that that way you're able to get your own feedback and then make revisions before the final draft is due next week. Thanks.